I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. I often find with changing transformation professionals that many switch between periods of time where they are operating independently to periods where they are employed. I suspect it's the nature of change that means that flexibility is a core component of a successful change and transformation career. That has certainly been the experience of Dave Reeves, who joins me on the virtual sofa today. Let me introduce you to Dave now. Okay, well, hi David, thanks for joining us today. You've had an interesting career in transformation across both contracts and permanent roles. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you got into transformation in the first place.
Hi, Tony. Okay, so I think I fell into transformation. I actually started out after my degree in operations, working in management, worked in the leisure sector, worked in retail. And I think where I first sort of experienced change in projects was working in the business when things were being implemented. So I was working in telecoms in the 90s, and we went through a significant period of change. We had growth, we had acquisition of businesses, and being in operations management, you were then, in the front line, you're working with the customers and you're seeing that. And I think what really interested me was that as we gradually evolved, I started with a company called CableTel that eventually became NTL, but it acquired a number of businesses. And so to everybody on the outside, you're one brand, you're one company. And yet behind that, there's lots of different operating systems, there's lots of different cultures and companies. And that really interested me because I'd moved then through a different number of roles to have a national role in retail management, and could see that there were opportunities, but could also see there were challenges. So that's where I first got my first interest of going in and learning more about projects. So I got involved. I was your subject matter expert. I was your end user. I was that person who was, why are we doing all these changes? I've got customers coming in. I've got enough on my plate. So that was quite a challenge because you often just had to do some of these things, and some of the timescales were very difficult. And so I think I learned to accept and understand more about that. And as I progressed through operations roles, I actually had an opportunity to go into project management. Right. And that was with Dixon Motors, a company who eventually got acquired by the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I have a lot to thank my boss at the time, who enabled me to go down that route. And I started off doing all the classic, let's learn Prince 2, manage successful programs. If I'm going to be a project manager, I need the textbook. And then learning very quickly that life's not like that, and there's not many projects that follow that path. Yeah. And since then, I've worked over the last 15 years in projects and programs, predominantly for myself, but more recently, interestingly, made the move back to being an employee, which is a challenge in itself when you're working in change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, but it's good though, isn't it, that you've had that operational experience as well. So you've been on the receiving end of other people trying to drive projects through and change through, and I'm sure you've adapted your style accordingly because you can remember some of the pain points that you went through when you were in the business.
Absolutely. The customers are very unforgiving. They don't understand that you had a project plan and that didn't quite come off. I can't access the systems. I've been in situations where we haven't had systems online and we've then had to revert back to manual, or things have failed. And whilst people are stressed on the project program dealing with that change, you're front and center with the customer who's just come in and sees that, why things operating as they should be. So I think that's really informed how I've looked at things. I'm very customer focused, and I'm very driven in terms of what the output is for the customer, and see that without it benefiting the customer, then why are we doing things? And often that is the challenge when you talk to other functions, because we might be wanting to make a change and it might streamline something for us, but what about the customer? Let's look at what that means to them.
Yeah, and it is. It's all too easy, isn't it? Just thinking about things in a very isolated, siloed way of thinking, but then not having the view or the impact assessment almost of what it will mean to other parts of the business, and it's a knock-on effect that I find that sometimes trips a lot of projects up.
Definitely. And I think that's ultimately the challenge, isn't it? That you don't go down a cul-de-sac in terms of what you're trying to do, that you've actually got the bigger picture. And I think, one of the key things for me is having that view of transformation from the top of the organization. I think you need to have that leadership. You need to have that executive sponsorship that sees it across the organization.
Yeah.
Where I've seen a lot of challenges in transformation is that it's very siloed and very focused specifically within IT. And I've experienced that firsthand where I've been in roles where I'm aligned to, reported with IT. And what that does is it gives it a very specific direction, as though the system is the solution.
Yeah.
I don't see that as being the way that change needs to be implemented.
I often say it's the tail wagging the dog in that scenario, isn't it? It's the business needs to understand what the business needs and then identify the right technology to allow it to achieve that. But all too often it's the other way around, isn't it? This is the new shiny object. How can we force that into the business?
Absolutely. And I've seen many times where we've had conversations where we want to buy this software, we want to go down this solution, we've got a good price, and I'm looking and saying, okay, so where are we trying to get to? Where are we today? Where are we trying to get to? What's the problem? And I think that's where I always bring it back to. What is the issue that we're trying to address? Many examples that we've worked through where that then informs things differently, because you also need to realize that you've got to take everybody on the journey. I know it sounds cliche, but unless everybody is on board and contributes to, you don't get to the heart of what the problem is. And I think that's what I've sought to do and tease out. And it's often that frustration, I think, probably in the wider organisation, that things initially, when you get into transformation, take a time because nothing's happening. And I'm a great believer that you need to spend that time up front to understand what the problem is and what your requirements are. So coming out of that, we've got something to build upon and work through. What I've done and done many times, I think, if I use an example of Avant Homes, a leading house builder in the north of England and in Scotland, we worked through that challenge by breaking projects down into smaller chunks, almost like what you would maybe see in other businesses as programs. We identified those to do them in 3 to 6 month delivery. So the scope of the project and the change was smaller, but it meant that you were able to apply the same rigor, and that enabled us to get through and implement changes and also learn, because the culture of the organisation wasn't used to transformation and doing projects in that way. It's come from a very traditional IT way of working. And so I think it enabled them to learn and see those changes, rather than, in 2 years, you'll have this great output and everything will be fine. You'll have the new system working as you want. And it evolved, and it also changed our approach, and it enabled us to learn and engage with stakeholders across the business. And what I enjoyed most about that was the engagement with the team. And because it was a regionally operated business, we engaged team members from across the regions. And it was all about, how do we get to define where we're going to? This isn't me defining it, I'm the facilitator. It was great to get the involvement from the team. It's challenging because you're getting lots of different viewpoints, but you're trying to bring that consensus together as to how we go forward. And by having the operational involvement, where you get the value is you then get the operational test, which is what we always did. So we would always do a pilot with the region before we rolled out, because best will in the world, however you design and work to implement a change, until you get to that operational environment, you don't know. There's always something that comes up, and it's amazing how many times just the smallest thing, or we've taken too many steps there, or the output isn't right for the customer, or actually we've forgotten something. And it's amazing no matter how many times you work through all of those challenges until you do that operational test with the customer and go through a number of times to actually get where it needs to land and inform it all the way through. And I feel like that's very important. And it's very important from the team that's involved, because they can then see they're being listened to, the value of their input, and that they get something that works for them and the customer at the end of the day.
I agree. I think it's something you mentioned right at the start, really, around the sort of the Prince and the managing successful projects, and the feeling that it's a structure that you've got to follow. But actually, it's what you've just been speaking about that determines successful programs and projects much more than having a structure that you follow to the letter of the law. Because like you, I've never been involved in a program that's followed Prince to the letter. Elements, absolutely, but if you don't engage with the people, and you don't have that sort of agile approach that says, let's test something out, let's make sure it's right, and then let's adapt it. And all too often I find is that those organisations that are very focused upon a format, a Prince or managing successful, or all of the various other ones, they spend so much time building out that project plan and never engage with the business at all. So they've got a perfect project plan, but it's just a recipe for disaster, because they haven't brought the people in and got the people involved in delivering and developing that plan, and it'll be those that are ultimately responsible for delivering it.
It becomes then too bureaucratic, doesn't it? You've got the whole administration and reporting that goes on around all of that, when actually, what are we doing? And I've certainly seen that. And I think what I enjoyed most of working for myself with my own consultancy for 12 years, Deliverable, was that it challenged me to be able to go into an organisation, understand where they are at, and that's in terms of where they're at with the proposed change, but also where they're at with their skills, their knowledge, methodology, approach, all of that. And it was about how do you tailor? And so I think that's the key learning for me over that period, was the ability to very quickly understand the organisation so that you can define where you can add value. And that was what I always sought to do. I've worked a number of clients in financial services, I've worked in chemicals, manufacturing, central government, house building. They're very varied. That's just to name a few. And everyone's got the same challenges, but you need to understand where the organisation is as you go into it, to understand then how do we go forward and what do we do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have conversations with lots of people like yourself that have deliberately worked across sectors, and the explanation around that, and I've done it myself. The explanation we often find is that, well, that's the variation, because what we do tends to, as you say, similar issues. Break an organisation down in whatever sector they're in, they all operate in roughly the same way. They've all got the same functions. So the variation comes from moving sectors and picking up different languages. But as you quite rightly say, no project is ever the same, because there's different people involved, different approaches, and going in and doing exactly what you've just said around really understanding where their challenges are, where their opportunities are. That creates the variation as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's what I really enjoyed, because it's a challenge to me, and that's for me how I developed my skills and saw where I could add value. But also, it's enabled me to then look at how I move forward. And that was why it was interesting to be able to go into a permanent role, and the reason for moving on board with Avant to do that was because I could actually establish business transformation as a function.
Yeah,
it's an interesting one, because any change, as soon as you embark on it, the outcome's always going to be different from where you started. And I think that's what we saw with Avant. Over 3 years, we did a number of projects to move the business forward, and you then get to a different endpoint because you've embarked on that change. You've changed the way that the organisation operates. And I think what I enjoyed about my time with Avant was the ability to look at how we can break down change into all the component parts. So for me, transformation it has to be led from the top down. It has to be driving and supporting business strategy. So if that's of growth, what are we doing to streamline, to be more efficient? But also it's got to be bottom up as well. So there's got to be the ability for everybody in the organisation to engage with that, and that's what we sought to do. We did many things from a standard way of working to intranet to cross-function forums to be able to get that engagement so that you can have both of those, because I'm a great believer that if you've got somebody in the organisation who sees a small change that can, it might only give us that much, but it's an improvement as to how we operate. They're then engaged with change and they see the value, and if they're being listened to and can contribute to that. And so we sought to recognise that. We had a program called Think Ideas where anybody could email to the CEO, and it was about working through all of those small changes. These weren't going to save us money. They might drive the improvement, they might increase customer satisfaction, but it created that culture. And I think cultural change is so important in any transformation for an organisation. It often gets overlooked, and I think that gave us the opportunity to go right across the spectrum, because yes, it's great to have the complex big programs, but it's also engaging and touching everybody in the organisation.
No, absolutely. And I noticed that you've worked on programs that have been UK centric, you've worked on programs that have been European centric and global programs. What lessons have you learned that across those sort of three areas, and specifically, I suppose, around culture?
Yeah, it's quite a challenge. I think one program that really stands out was working with Formica, and the program was based in the UK, but the implementation was in North America. And so I would spend probably every 6 weeks, I'd be going out to Cincinnati in Ohio to work with the team there. And one of the earliest things that I did was to actually go out and work with the team to whiteboard, how do we actually build this program? So, I mean, it literally was starting from that blank whiteboard as to how do we put all the component parts together. And what I found was that even though we spoke the same language, on a Monday we weren't on the same page, and it would often take till the Friday to be there. And I think just because you're coming from things that different perspective, and it was a great learning curve for me to take that on board. And also, it's all about communication, isn't it? And engaging so that you can collaborate. And it takes time. And I think it's understanding those cultural differences and being able to recognise and take those forward. Certainly seen it on European programmes. Global programmes, even more of a challenge, especially if dealing with Australia and New Zealand because of the time difference. But it's about having a clear path and seeking wherever possible to engage. Email. It's interesting with everything we've gone through with lockdown. We're doing probably more face-to-face communication than we were previously, which I find very interesting, because before you would very much rely on maybe email and communication that way. So I think by having access to tools like we are doing today, I think that really helps, because you're able to then see and engage with the person and work through. But look, don't get me wrong, we've had challenges. Things haven't gone well, and often it comes down to that communication. Certainly with Formica, just underestimating and seeing that people want to do a good job, but I think we've also found that people will underestimate how long things will take.
Yes,
if you're going through that design stage, and then you find you're not got the resource, or you're into conflicting priorities. So I think it's about being transparent, and I've always sought to do that. If there's any bad news, let's understand it as soon as we can, and let's be realistic in how we plan and put things forward. I've never worked on any program where everybody's happy with the end date, because everyone wants to do things sooner. I think that's just natural, that people will try and deliver things as quickly as possible. But I try and be pragmatic as to getting everybody along the journey, and I think what I've learned at the sum of all of these programs is that you can only go as go as fast as the slowest person. And I think you've got to make sure you do everything you can to engage that person and understand why.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a fine balance, isn't there, between being too cautious and slowing the process, but trying to do it too quickly and not taking the people with you. And a pragmatic approach tends to be the one that delivers most success. But that can be challenging, especially if you've got a senior sponsor that is committed to the board, especially when there's significant external investment around that board table as well. I've done a lot of work with private equity backed businesses, and the board have committed to doing something to that private equity investor, and things go wrong then, and that's an interesting conversation to be having. But it is I found that the way to go through that is very much focus upon, it's all about landing that change, and not just getting the technology in, or not just doing whatever it is. It's about getting the people on board that will drive, because it's the people that will drive the value, not the technology or the new widget.
Absolutely. And where I've sought to then spend a large part of my time is understanding the makeup of the team, the capability, because I think it's one thing to commit to something, but then if you've not got the skills, how do we get there? How do you develop that capability? So that's something that's really interested me over recent years. I've worked with a mix of, obviously, when I've worked for myself externally, contract resource, but also I've managed teams as part of that, and also as an employee. And so I've had that balance of external and internal. And I think it's about trying to strike the right blend of skills and knowledge to be able to get you there, and also see that change goes beyond that implementation date. We've not done, everybody can go away and celebrate and, great job. Actually, more of the work for me then is about the embedding and how we ensure that sticks. It does what we were expecting, and get that feedback. So, I've certainly had those challenges, it's always entertaining, because there's always something new coming up. So that's why I've remained working in this area, because I just find it so fascinating.
No, it's interesting that as you say, that post-implementation support. My daughter passed a driving test last week, and it's the same analogy, isn't it? It's like, well, now you'll learn to drive, but it's the same, isn't it? We've gone live, but now the change will now start.
Yes, we've gone through that, and it takes a while. Yes, so you've got a few months to go on that one, I think, Tony.
Absolutely, I'm sure. So every time she goes out now, it's like, oh my God. So, what do you think is the main sort of characteristics of successful transformation then?
I think it's just having a clear intent. I think one of those that really sticks in my mind at Avant was that we were defining. I got given this task of standard operating procedures. We had different regions, and we were looking to make sure it was standard. Anybody being given a standard operating procedures project, that is not the most exciting. Yes. And so we certainly had our work cut out there, but we also had 4 months to do it. So you talked earlier about having a specific deadline, and the vision was clear. We wanted to drive efficiency, but we also wanted to improve the experience of the customers. And we understood that we had different ways of working in our 5 operating regions, and so it was bringing it all together. So the chief operating officer wanted a clear view, and he wanted to launch it at our annual conference in 4 months' time. So I think what that is a great example of, it gave clarity, and it was about engagement from fellow directors on the board, and then through the organisation. We worked through so that we had a clear roadmap, and it's one of those where I have an immovable date at the end, and I work back from that, and bringing all those things to bear, the skills, the involvement of the team, bringing in external knowledge, to try and pull all that together to do that, which we did. I mean, it's one of the most challenging pieces of work because there was no template as to what that's going to look like. I've just got 4 months to be able to mobilize, engage with all the teams and get there. And so I think having that clear vision and having a clear, end goal, and in this case, an end date, it enabled us to then build that out. But I think it still does evolve as you go through. And I think the key is having that communication. So I would regularly not only report back to the COO, but also the board on progress and engage, because it did evolve. We've talked about that earlier. It isn't fixed and clear. And, I open the book and I follow these stages. So I think it is agile and it will evolve as you go. So I think by having that as you go through, and I've certainly seen that on a number of other programs, by having that clear intent at the start and validating and checking back against that as you go through, things, there's certain changes as we went along, but ultimately we got there and we rolled it out. And that was a key change. One of the key things, we involved marketing, so we put some branding around it. So actually, what we came up with was the About way of working. So it was the About wow, and to then put the branding internally on the intranet and posters and other documentation. It had an identity, and it enabled everybody in the organisation to see that was going to become part of our DNA as to how we operated, and we evolved and we iterated that as we went forward over the following year as well. So I think it's just being clear, but also you've got to make sure that you check back against that as you go forward, dealing with the change.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that, though. I think absolutely the marketing piece and making it real and giving it some sort of a branding is a really successful way of delivering that type of change. And I just like organisations to come up with something else other than the way. So I've been in so many organisations that it's the Avant way, it's the XYZ way, it's whatever it is, but it works absolutely. But it'd be really good if someone could come up with something else other than the way.
I think what we also did as we went through that journey, I mean, it was interesting to identify that, because I think where we'd got previously was things were paper copies and files on cabinets. They weren't being lived, they weren't part of how we operate. So that was a step one. And what I've always sought to do is then look at, well, how can I push the boundaries? How can we evolve? Where can we go next? And what we did the following year was we actually moved to embrace all functions. So we focused very much on the core business operating functions, frontline with customer in phase one. Phase two is all the support functions, so everything from health and safety, HR, business transformation as well. And we put that in on a digital platform. So we created a digital knowledge platform that meant that it was a bit like having your own search facility. Think of other search facilities that there are within the company. You can search on processes, you can search on the glossary, and you can very quickly find the information that you need. It's handheld devices, it's available, it's very accessible. And so I think for me, what I learned as we went through that was, don't just stand there that you've achieved that change. You've got to look at how you evolve and operate. Our workforce, the age of the workforce that we had, used to having things on tablets, mobile devices.
Yeah.
As a business, we didn't operate in that way. That enabled us to go to that. And so you engaged with people who, I don't use paper, or I just want to see it on my phone. So that addressed some of the culture changes. The organisation was changing by going through those steps. So yeah, we'll have to think about the name for the future programs that we work on. But what was really interesting on that was the mechanisms and how we actually managed to use the tools.
Yeah, as you say, I think it's important, especially we're in an interesting period, I think, because within the workforce, you've still got people of a certain age, and I'll include myself in that actually when we were at school, technology was only just coming into play. So we're sort of the sort of transition, and then there's older people that haven't been brought up in that world, and then you say you've got your sort of generation X and Generation Y that actually, if it's not on a phone or it's not on a tablet, it just doesn't exist.
And that was really interesting because of that. As you say, it's on the one hand, you've got people who are very, open and willing and wanting that technology, but equally, I've got site managers who don't use the phone, and so I would go to training sessions, and you've got people using tablets, and they're not used to using the technology. I'm fine. I've got my piece of paper. I know where I'm at. I've got my checklist, and it was just joining it up so that they could see, but also taking the time. Working in the house building industry, very manual. Processes very manually driven. Everything around construction, is largely manual. So that's quite a change. And I think what we recognised was the need to actually just go and embed and go back. And so we did a number of changes to embed and build upon. So when we introduced checklists, when we'd implement another one down the line, it's an opportunity to refresh and engage with the team again. That's the direction things are going in. So, but it also gave us benchmarks. It gave us measures that we didn't have in the business previously, and it enabled us to look at how we were doing scoring through all the different stages with customers and to get that feedback. And I think anything like that is priceless because it enables you to then see, well, you were thinking of going that way, but actually what you've learned from that is we've got other priorities or other things we need to address.
Absolutely. And I think that then starts to formulate the subsequent programs of change, doesn't it? As you've got much more data, that you can make more rational decisions rather than decisions of the heart, which has tended to be in the past.
Definitely. And for me, any transformation data is at the heart of that, and it's trying to get to that point. Yes, we need the technology. Yes, process, people. But for me, what brings all of that together is the data, because we need to understand what's happening. We need to understand whether we are actually achieving on the quality or we are getting the levels of engagement. So there's so much that we can learn from that, and I think that underpins any transformation an organisation is seeking to do.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect place to conclude. Thank you very much, David. We occasionally get questions. Are you quite happy if I collate them to sort of follow up with people?
Absolutely.
Super. Well, once again, thank you very much. And let's keep in touch.
Thanks, Tony.
Once again, cheers, Dave. A great show. In addition to getting involved in this podcast, Dave has recently joined the Transformation Leaders Hub, our community focused completely on changing transformation professionals. We have a big vision for the Hub, building a global network, actively introducing members to each other, and generating in excess of £100 million worth of fees and salaries for our members over the next 5 years. Take a look at what's on offer today. Click on the link within the show notes, and I'll see you in the clubhouse. Bye for now.